The first time I understood what I was to my family, I was 9 years old, standing in a kitchen doorway in Wayne, Pennsylvania, listening to my mother tell my aunt on the phone that Vanessa was the one who needed watching, and I was the one who never gave anyone trouble. She said it like a compliment. It took me 25 more years to understand it was a life sentence. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 34 years old. I work as a marketing director for a medical device company outside Philadelphia, and until the second Saturday of September, I believed I had made peace with being the daughter nobody worried about. That Saturday, in a mountain resort 3 hours outside the city, at my younger sister's wedding, my whole family showed me exactly how little peace there actually was. I want to tell you what happened, from the beginning, because if I only tell you about the wedding, you won't understand why I did what I did. You'll think it was petty. You'll think I was a jealous older sister who couldn't stand to watch someone else shine. I need you to know the 25 years that came before it. And if you've ever been the kid in your family who is expected to be fine, always fine, no matter what, stay with me. I think you'll recognize a lot of this. Vanessa is 5 years younger than me. From the moment she was born, our house reorganized itself around her. I don't say that with bitterness anymore, or at least I try not to. I say it because it's simply what happened. She had asthma as a toddler, and my parents' fear over that never really left, even after she outgrew it at 7. She became the fragile one, the one who needed extra attention, extra softness, extra forgiveness. And somewhere in there, I became the opposite, the sturdy one, the one who didn't need anything. When I was 12, I won a regional essay competition sponsored by the Pennsylvania Historical Society. First place, $300, and a certificate my English teacher, Mrs. Halloran, mailed to the house because I'd been too nervous to bring it home myself. My mother put it in a kitchen drawer. 2 weeks later, Vanessa, who was 7, drew a picture of a horse that got hung on the refrigerator for 4 months. When I was 16, I got my driver's license on the first attempt. My father shook my hand. When Vanessa got hers on her third attempt, 2 years later, they took her to Cracker Barrel to celebrate. I'm not telling you these things because I think a horse drawing and a driving test are crimes. I'm telling you because that was the pattern over and over for 22 years. So consistent it became architecture. My effort was expected. Her existence was celebrated. The tuition was the part that still sits in my chest like a stone some days. I got into Villanova in 2010, and money was tight that year. My father had been laid off from his engineering job at a manufacturing plant in Chester County for 8 months. My parents told me gently that they could contribute $4,000 a year, and the rest would be loans and work study. I did the math, took out $31,000 in federal loans over 4 years, worked 22 hours a week at a campus bookstore, and graduated with honors in 2014. I paid off the last of those loans in March of 2023, 9 years later, the week of my 32nd birthday. Vanessa went to Elon in 2017. By then, my father was back at his old salary plus a promotion, and somehow they found $38,000 a year for her, no loans, no work study. When I asked my mother about it once, carefully, not looking for a fight, just looking for an answer, she said, "Well, things were different by then. You understand?" I did understand. I understood completely. Things weren't different. I was different. I was the one who could absorb difficulty without anyone feeling responsible for it. I want to be fair to Vanessa here, because this isn't really her fault. Not entirely. Kids don't build the systems they grow up inside of. She was handed a family that centered her, and she took the seat she was given, the way any of us might have. What she did with that seat later, though, that part is on her. By the time she was 26, Vanessa was working in event planning in Boston, and I was 31, newly promoted to marketing director, living alone in a one-bedroom apartment in Manayunk that I'd furnished entirely myself, piece by piece, over 3 years, because I refused to go into debt again for anything that wasn't essential. I liked my life. I want that on the record too. I wasn't sitting around waiting to be noticed. I had built something quiet and solid, and most days it was enough. Then, in the spring of last year, Vanessa got engaged to a man named Ethan Brooks. Ethan was 31, from a family that owned a chain of boutique hotels across New England, the kind of family whose name occasionally showed up in Boston Business Journal. He was soft-spoken, a little awkward in a way I found genuinely endearing the 2 times I met him, and clearly completely infatuated with my sister. At the engagement dinner in June, at a restaurant in Back Bay where the tasting menu alone cost more than my monthly car payment, I watched him look at Vanessa the way you look at something you can't quite believe you get to keep. I remember thinking, I hope she deserves that. I didn't let myself think past that thought. Not yet. The wedding was set for a Saturday in September, at a resort in the Pocono Mountains called Cedar Hollow Lodge, the kind of venue with a wall of glass overlooking a lake, 12-foot ceilings, and a per-plate cost, I later learned, of $340, 210 guests, an open bar that ran until midnight. A photographer flown in from Charleston because he'd shot some influencer's wedding Vanessa liked on Instagram. I found out about the seating 3 days before the wedding, though I didn't understand what I was actually finding out. My mother, Diane, called me on a Wednesday night while I was making dinner, and somewhere in the middle of logistics. What time to arrive? Which hotel block to book? She said, almost as an afterthought. You'll be at table 14, near the back, so don't worry about dressing up too formal. It's more of a casual area. I didn't think much of it at the time. I said, okay. I hung up. It wasn't until I was standing in that hallway 2 days later that I understood what casual area had actually meant. The morning of the wedding, I drove 4 hours from Philadelphia by myself. Vanessa hadn't asked me to be a bridesmaid, which stung less than I expected it to, honestly, because I'd half known it was coming since the engagement party, when she introduced her bridal party to me one by one, 3 college friends from Elon and a cousin on Ethan's side, like she was reading a list she assumed I already knew I wasn't on. Somewhere around Allentown, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. I read it at a red light. Please don't make today about yourself. Today is Vanessa's day, and I need you to be supportive and low-key. We love you. I sat with that message for a long time, longer than the light stayed red. I hadn't done anything. I hadn't said anything. I hadn't even arrived yet. And still, the assumption baked into that text was so total, so instinctive, that it barely registered to my mother as an accusation. It was just how she talked to me. Stay quiet. Don't need anything. Disappear neatly into the background of somebody else's happiness. I'd been doing that my whole life, and she still felt the need to remind me, as if my very presence at my sister's wedding was a risk that needed managing. I didn't respond. I turned up the radio and kept driving. Cedar Hollow Lodge, when I arrived, was exactly as beautiful as the wedding website had promised. Stone pathways wound between actual cedar trees strung with warm white lights that hadn't been switched on yet in the early afternoon sun. Through the wall of windows I could see the reception hall being finished. Round tables draped in ivory linen, low arrangements of white roses and eucalyptus, crystal chandeliers hanging from exposed wooden beams, the whole room lit gold by the late afternoon light coming off the lake. Someone was testing a microphone. A string quartet was tuning instruments near a small stage. It smelled like cedar and candle wax and, faintly, like the lake water drifting in through a propped open service door. I found a young woman near the entrance with a clipboard and a headset, clearly the day of coordinator, and gave her my name so she could point me to my table. She scanned her chart, frowned slightly, scanned it again, and then looked up at me with an expression I recognized instantly, because I'd worn that same expression myself plenty of times at work when I had to deliver information I didn't like being the one to deliver. "Claire Bennett?" she asked, just to confirm. "Sister of the bride?" "That's me." She hesitated. "Can you give me 1 second?" She walked away and spoke quietly with another staff member near the kitchen doors, glancing back at me twice. I stood there in my navy dress, holding a wrapped gift box under one arm, feeling something cold start to move through my stomach, even though I didn't yet know why. When she came back, her voice had gone soft in the specific way people's voices go soft right before they say something they're embarrassed to say. "So, it looks like your seating is actually... It's not in the main ballroom," she said. "There's a table set up in the service corridor, just outside the kitchen entrance. I'm so sorry. I don't usually see this, but the seating chart was finalized directly by the family, and that's what's listed for you." For a moment, I genuinely thought I'd misheard her. "The service corridor," I repeated. "It's just through there." She gestured toward a narrow hallway visible past a half-open door beside the main entrance to the ballroom, the kind of hallway meant for waitstaff to move between the kitchen and the floor, lined with rolling carts and stacked chairs. "There's a table and a chair set up. I want to say again, I'm really sorry. This isn't standard. I can go check with the family if you'd like." I told her not to bother. I already knew what checking would produce. I knew my mother's voice, the careful, patient explanation she'd give, the way she'd somehow make it sound reasonable, the way she always did. I walked through that half-open door myself, still holding the gift. The hallway was narrow, maybe 6 feet across, lined with beige walls and industrial carpet, lit by a single humming fluorescent panel overhead. Along one side sat 3 enormous rolling trash bins, the commercial kind, lids propped slightly open, one of them giving off a faint sour smell of discarded shellfish from whatever the kitchen staff had been prepping. Across from the bins, someone had set up a small round table with a single folding chair, a plain white tablecloth thrown over it that didn't quite reach the floor on one side. No flowers, no place card holder, just my name written on an index card and propped against a water glass. Through the wall, muffled but unmistakable, I could hear the string quartet begin playing something soft as guests started filtering into the ballroom, laughing, greeting each other, glasses already clinking. I stood in that hallway for a long moment, my gift still tucked under my arm, and I felt something settle in me that wasn't quite anger yet. It was closer to clarity. 25 years of birthday cakes that skipped my name in the candles' shadow, of essay awards shoved into drawers, of tuition gaps explained away as circumstance, of texts telling me not to make anything about myself. All of it arrived at once, in a service hallway, next to 3 bins of kitchen garbage, on the day my family had decided, formally and in writing, exactly where I belonged. I don't know how long I stood there before the coordinator came back, apologetic all over again, asking if I wanted water, if I wanted anything at all, clearly uncomfortable with what she'd been ordered to set up. I told her I was fine. It wasn't her fault. I sat down at the little folding table, set my gift on the floor beside my chair, and tried to decide what kind of person I wanted to be for the next few hours. I want to tell you, I sat there seething, plotting something immediately. That's not what happened. What happened is I sat there, and I thought about my grandmother, my father's mother, Ruth Bennett, who died when I was 22, and who used to be the one person in that family who saw me clearly. She used to say, "Claire, you don't have to shout to be somebody. You just have to stop apologizing for the space you take up." I hadn't thought about that in years. I thought about it a lot in that hallway. I was maybe 15 minutes into sitting there, listening to toasts I couldn't quite make out through the wall, when the door swung open and Vanessa walked through. She looked stunning. I'll give her that. Her dress was a fitted mermaid silhouette in ivory silk. Custom, I'd later learn, from a designer in New York, with a low back and a cathedral-length veil she'd pinned up for the reception. Her hair was down in loose curls, and she'd clearly just finished a fresh round of photos, because there was still a faint dust of setting powder catching the fluorescent light along her jaw. She looked at me sitting at that folding table like she was checking on a piece of furniture she'd ordered and wanted confirmed as delivered. "Oh, good. You found it," she said, and smiled in a way that had no warmth behind it at all. "I told them to make sure you were comfortable." "Comfortable?" I repeated. "I mean, honestly, Claire." She glanced toward the trash bins, wrinkled her nose slightly, then looked back at me. And something shifted in her expression. Something that had been sitting under the surface for years, finally deciding to come up for air. "I guess this is where you belong. Nobody would even notice if you weren't here." I want you to understand. I had braced myself for a lot of things that day. I had not braced myself for that particular sentence, delivered that plainly, like a fact she'd simply decided to share. There's a version of me from 10 years ago who would have cried right there, or apologized, or found some way to make the moment smaller so it would hurt less. I didn't do any of that. I looked at my sister in her $10,000 dress, standing in a hallway that smelled like discarded shellfish, and I said, "There was always room for both of us. You were the one pushing me out." She rolled her eyes, the exact gesture she'd been making at me since she was 6 years old and I was 11, and turned to walk back through the door. Before she disappeared, though, she paused and added one more thing over her shoulder, like an afterthought that wasn't really an afterthought at all. "You were never meant to matter, Claire. Not to this family, not to anyone. Figure that out already." The door swung shut behind her, and the string quartet swelled again, and I sat alone with 3 trash bins and a gift I'd spent 2 months debating whether to give her at all. Because here's the thing I hadn't told anyone yet. Not my parents, not my closest friend Megan, not a single person. 3 weeks before that wedding, I'd learned something about my sister that had been sitting in me like a splinter I hadn't decided what to do with. It happened at a business lunch in Boston, of all places. I'd flown up for a 2-day medical device conference at the seaport, and on the second afternoon I'd ended up at a small Italian place near the convention center with a colleague from a partner company and 2 of her coworkers. One of them, a sharp, funny woman in her late 20s named Olivia Parker, mentioned partway through lunch that she used to work in event planning at a firm downtown, before switching into pharmaceutical sales. "Actually," I said, mostly making conversation, "my sister works in event planning in Boston. Vanessa Bennett. Small world. Maybe you know her." Olivia's face did something specific in that moment. A flicker, quickly smoothed over. The kind of expression you give when a name lands somewhere you didn't expect it to land. "Vanessa Bennett," she repeated slowly. Yeah, I know Vanessa. We worked together for about a year at Prestige Event Collective." Something in her tone made me set my fork down. "You don't sound thrilled about that." She glanced at the others at the table, then back at me, and I watched her make a small internal decision. "Look, I don't want to speak out of turn, and I don't know what your relationship with her is like. But is she still engaged to that hotel guy? Ethan something?" My stomach did something slow and unpleasant. "Ethan Brooks. They're getting married in September." Olivia exhaled through her nose. Not quite a laugh. "Wow. Okay." She pulled her phone out of her bag, scrolled for a moment, and then turned it toward me. I kept these because at the time it genuinely worried me, and I almost said something to him at a work event once, and then I didn't. because it wasn't my business. But since you're asking, what she showed me was a group chat, screenshotted from about a year and a half earlier, between Vanessa and two friends from her old job. I read it twice to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding the tone, but there was no misunderstanding it. Vanessa: okay, but he's so rich. It's actually insane. His family owns like 6 hotels, friend. Are you even into him? Though lol. Vanessa: does it matter? I'll learn to be into him. I'm not stupid. I'm not marrying for love at 28 when I could marry for a lake house, friend. Or unhinged Vanessa: watch. In 5 years, I cry about how unhappy I am and take half of everything. I've seen his prenup already, BTW. My lawyer says there's holes in it if timing is right. There was more. Screenshots from a few months later, after the engagement, where she talked about phase 2, about how Ethan's mother Eleanor didn't fully trust her yet, but that old money families always come around once there's a ring on it, about specific financial assets, a boutique property in Newport she referred to by name, investment accounts she'd apparently already asked pointed questions about during a family dinner. In one message, dated maybe 4 months before the wedding, she wrote, "The second thing goes sideways, I start the sad wife act. Cry about how lonely I am, how he works too much. By year 3, I walk with alimony plus whatever I can get flagged as marital property. I've literally mapped this out. I sat in that restaurant in Boston holding a stranger's phone, looking at my sister's handwriting laid bare in a way I'd never seen it before, and I felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with jealousy and everything to do with a kind of grief I didn't have a name for yet. Olivia asked me to send the screenshots to myself if I wanted them. Said she'd been carrying a low hum of guilt about the whole thing for over a year, unsure whether it was her place to warn a man she'd met twice at company events. I took the photos. I thanked her. I finished my lunch, and don't remember tasting a single bite of it. For 3 weeks after that, I did nothing. I told myself it wasn't my business, the same story Olivia had told herself. I told myself maybe people say cruel, calculating things in group chats they don't actually mean, blowing off steam the way people do. I told myself Ethan was an adult, capable of protecting himself, and that whatever happened in his marriage wasn't mine to prevent. Some nights I almost convinced myself of all of it, but I kept thinking about Eleanor Brooks, Ethan's mother, who I'd met exactly once, at the engagement dinner, and who had struck me as sharp and careful in a way that suggested she already had questions of her own. And I kept thinking about Ethan himself, the way he'd looked at Vanessa across that restaurant table in June, like she was something rare he still couldn't quite believe belonged to him. Sitting in that hallway, next to those bins, having just been told by my own sister that I was never meant to matter to anyone, I stopped debating. I reached into my bag, pulled out the folded printouts I'd been carrying since Boston, tucked inside a planner where I'd half hoped I would simply forget about them, and I opened the gift I'd brought. A crystal serving set, $400, carefully wrapped that morning at my kitchen table with a bow I'd practiced twice on a spare box first. I lifted the lid just enough to slide the screenshots inside, flat against the tissue paper, along with a single index card on which I wrote, in handwriting I kept as steady as I could manage, Vanessa. I found these 3 weeks ago and said nothing because I hoped I was wrong about you. Ethan deserves to know who he's marrying. I hope, somewhere in you, there's still a person who's sorry. Claire. I closed the box. I retied the bow, and I carried it through the service door, back into the golden light and string quartet warmth of the ballroom, walked directly to the long gift table set up near the entrance among dozens of other wrapped boxes and envelopes, and set mine down gently among them, angled so the tag with Vanessa and Ethan's names faced up. Nobody stopped me. Nobody even looked at me, which felt, in that particular moment, like the most honest thing that had happened to me all day. I walked back out through the front entrance, past the cedar trees strung with lights that had finally switched on as the sky started dimming, and I got into my car in the gravel lot. I sat there for a moment with my hands on the wheel, feeling strangely, unexpectedly calm, the way you feel right after you've made a decision you know you can't take back. I started the engine. That's when I heard it. Even through the closed windows, even across the parking lot. A scream from inside the ballroom, high and sharp and unmistakably real, followed almost immediately by a rising wave of voices, dozens of them at once, the specific chaotic sound of 200 people simultaneously realizing something has gone terribly wrong. I turned the engine off again. I told myself I was just going to sit there for a minute, that I wasn't going to go back in. That whatever was happening now belonged to the people inside that ballroom and not to me anymore. I lasted about 90 seconds before I got out of the car and walked back toward the lodge, staying near the side entrance, close enough to see through the wall of windows without being seen myself. Later, I pieced together the exact sequence from 3 different people: the coordinator, my father, and eventually Ethan himself. Because I wasn't in the room for the worst of it. But I've replayed it enough times, heard it described in enough detail, that I can tell it to you, almost like I watched it happen. The gift opening had started right on schedule, a tradition Vanessa insisted on, apparently against her wedding planner's advice, because she wanted what she called a moment in front of everyone before the dancing started. She and Ethan sat at a small table near the head table, opening presents one at a time while a bridesmaid read out cards and the room half watched, half continued their own conversations over champagne. My gift was maybe the 8th or ninth one opened. Vanessa lifted the lid, saw the crystal serving set, said something appreciative for the crowd, and then noticed the folded papers tucked beside the tissue paper. She later claimed, when questioned, that she assumed it was just a card, and reached for it without thinking. Ethan was the one who actually unfolded it. He read the index card first, my note, and according to the coordinator, who was standing nearby restocking champagne glasses, his expression changed almost immediately, confusion sliding into something colder. Then he unfolded the printed screenshots. He read them at the table, in front of roughly 40 guests seated close enough to notice something was wrong, though most of the room hadn't caught on yet. His mother, Eleanor, was seated 2 tables away, and according to my father, who was seated near enough to see her face, she went very still the moment she saw what Ethan was holding, because, and this came out only over the following days, Eleanor had received an anonymous email 2 months earlier containing similar screenshots, sent from an account she couldn't trace, and had spent weeks debating whether to believe it or dismiss it as some jealous ex-coworker trying to sabotage the wedding. She'd decided, against her better instincts, to say nothing and give Vanessa the benefit of the doubt, for Ethan's sake, seeing the same messages again, in her son's hands, at his own wedding, apparently erased whatever benefit of the doubt she had left. The scream I'd heard from the parking lot came from one of Vanessa's bridesmaids, who'd leaned over to see what Ethan was reading and reacted before she'd fully processed what she was reacting to. Ethan stood up. He didn't shout. Everyone I talked to afterward agreed on this detail, that he was eerily calm, the calm of someone whose mind has already moved 3 steps past the moment everyone else is still catching up to. He held the papers up, not to the whole room, just angled toward Vanessa, and asked her, quietly enough that most guests strained to hear it, "Is any of this true?" Vanessa's first move was denial. She said the messages were fake, doctored, that someone had photoshopped her name into a fabricated conversation. When Ethan pointed out that the dates lined up with specific events he remembered, a family dinner at his parents' house where his mother's Newport property had come up in conversation, a weekend trip where Vanessa had asked oddly specific questions about his investment portfolio. Her story shifted. She said it was a joke between friends, dark humor, that anyone could say cruel things in a private chat that didn't reflect what they actually felt. Then she turned and pointed at me. I wasn't in the room, remember? So I only know this part because 5 separate guests described it to me almost identically over the following weeks, unprompted at family gatherings I hadn't wanted to attend. Vanessa told the room I had forged the documents out of jealousy, that I'd always resented her happiness, that this was exactly the kind of thing I would do to ruin her one perfect day. It might have worked if not for Eleanor Brooks standing up from her table, walking over, and calmly telling her son and everyone within earshot that she'd received the same information 2 months earlier, from a source that had nothing to do with me, someone she'd never met, and that she'd chosen not to say anything because she'd wanted to believe the best about Vanessa. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she said, apparently looking directly at Ethan. "I should have told you the moment I got that email. This isn't new information. It's just the second time it's shown up." That detail is the one that actually ended things. Not my screenshots alone. Those Vanessa might have argued away as some kind of elaborate revenge plot by a bitter sister. But 2 separate sources, from 2 different points in time, with no connection to each other, telling the same story, there was no explaining that away. My father told me later that the room went almost completely silent at that point, the kind of silence you could hear the lake lapping through, before Ethan reached into the interior pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a folded document. He'd apparently been carrying it since before the ceremony. His mother later admitted she'd insisted he have their family lawyer draft it just in case, after her own doubts 2 months earlier, a formal statement she'd hoped he'd never need to use. Ethan set it on the gift table, next to the torn wrapping paper and the crystal serving set still sitting in its box, and said, loud enough this time for the whole room to hear, that the marriage was over. Not separating. Not annulling later, quietly, through lawyers, the way these things usually happen. Over, announced, in front of every person who'd flown in to watch it begin. Nobody clapped. Nobody gasped anymore. They'd already used that up. My mother, according to 2 different accounts, stood frozen near the cake table, one hand pressed flat against her chest, staring at Vanessa like she was seeing a stranger wearing her daughter's face. I watched the aftermath begin to spill outside from where I stood near the side entrance, guests filtering out in stunned clusters, some already on their phones, a few of Vanessa's college friends crying in the parking lot, Ethan's family gathering him into a tight, protective circle and walking him toward a car without a single glance back at the ballroom. I didn't try to talk to anyone. I got back in my own car and drove. My phone started ringing before I'd even reached the resort's exit road. My mother, then my father, then my mother again, over and over, 12 missed calls by the time I stopped at a gas station 40 minutes down the mountain to fill my tank and buy a coffee I didn't really want, just to have something to hold. I didn't answer a single one. I wasn't avoiding a conversation out of fear. I genuinely had nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in that hallway, by my sister, in 6 words that had taken her 29 years to finally admit out loud. I got home to my apartment in Manayunk a little after 11 that night. I changed out of my navy dress, made myself a cup of tea I mostly let go cold, and sat on my couch, scrolling through nothing in particular on my phone while, somewhere 3 hours north, a family I used to belong to was presumably still trying to figure out what had just happened to them. Around midnight, a text finally came through from my father, not my mother. "Your mother and I need to talk to you. Please call when you can. This has gotten out of hand and we need to understand what happened." I read it twice. I set the phone face down on my coffee table, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I went to bed without checking it again before I fell asleep. I let 3 days pass before I answered anyone. It wasn't a strategy. I just genuinely needed the silence. I went to work Monday morning like nothing had happened, ran a product launch meeting, answered 40-some emails, and drove home each evening to an apartment that felt, for the first time in years, entirely like mine, uncomplicated by anyone else's expectations of who I was supposed to be inside it. If you've ever pulled away from people who hurt you and felt guilty about the quiet that followed, I want you to know that quiet isn't the same as cruelty. Sometimes it's just the first real breath you've taken in a long time. That's genuinely what those 3 days felt like. My father called again Wednesday night, and this time I answered, mostly because I could hear in the pattern of his calls, steady, spaced out, none of them angry voicemails, that he wasn't calling to accuse me of anything. Richard Bennett has never been a loud man. In 59 years, he's raised his voice around me maybe 4 times that I can remember, and I could tell from the first, "Claire, hi, thank you for picking up," that this wasn't going to be the 5th. "I want to understand what happened," he said. "Not to blame you. I need you to know that going in. Your mother and I have talked about very little else since Saturday, and most of what we've talked about is you." I told him everything. Boston, Olivia, the screenshots I'd carried in my planner for 3 weeks like something radioactive, the service hallway, the trash bins. What Vanessa had said to me, word for word, because by then I'd said it silently to myself enough times that it had worn smooth like a stone. There was a long silence on the line after I finished, long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. "She told her mother she belonged with the garbage," my father finally said. Not really to me, more like he was testing the sentence out loud to see if it was real. "Our seating chart had you at table 14. I saw it. I approved it. I didn't know they'd moved you again after that. Into a hallway. I want you to know, I didn't know about the hallway." "Would it have mattered if you did?" I asked. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I genuinely wanted to know. He didn't answer right away, and the not answering told me most of what I needed. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "I'd like to think so. I keep going back through everything, Claire. The essay contest, the tuition. I remember all of it now, sitting here, and I don't understand how I let 20 years go by without noticing the shape of it." I told him I appreciated him saying that, and I meant it, though I also understood, even as I said it, that an apology arriving 25 years late doesn't undo the years, it just names them. My father asked quietly if I would be willing to talk to my mother. I said I would call her when I was ready, and not before, and he accepted that without pushing, which was new. My mother called 2 days after that. Our conversation was harder, longer, and messier than the one with my father, mostly because Diane Bennett doesn't do quiet self-examination the way he does. She started by trying to explain the seating as a miscommunication with the venue, then shifted, when I pushed back gently, into explaining that Vanessa had been under enormous stress leading up to the wedding and hadn't been herself. I let her get about 4 minutes into that before I stopped her. "Mom, she told me I was never meant to matter to anyone. That's not wedding stress. That's 29 years of watching how this family treats me," finally said out loud. The line went quiet. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its rehearsed quality. "I don't know how to fix 25 years, Claire. I don't know where you'd even want me to start." "I don't either," I told her honestly. "But you could start by not asking me to fix it for you." We didn't resolve much on that call, not in any tidy way, but it was the first real conversation my mother and I had had in longer than I could remember, without either of us performing a version of ourselves for the other's comfort. Vanessa, notably, never called at all. The fallout from the wedding itself moved fast once it started, the way these things tend to once the first domino goes. Ethan's family, I learned through my parents over the following weeks, moved immediately to formalize the separation. Since the marriage had technically been solemnized before the reception, though barely 2 hours earlier, It wasn't a simple case of walking away from an engagement. There was a marriage on paper that needed to be legally undone, and Ethan's family's lawyer filed for annulment within the first week, citing fraud and misrepresentation, given the documented evidence that Vanessa had entered the marriage under demonstrably false pretenses about her intentions. Pennsylvania and Massachusetts have different standards for this kind of thing, and I won't pretend to understand every detail of how it eventually got resolved. But by early November, court records confirmed the marriage had been annulled rather than dissolved through a standard divorce, which meant, among other things, that Vanessa had no claim whatsoever to marital property, alimony, or any of the financial protections a longer marriage might have afforded her. The prenup she'd apparently already found holes in never even became relevant, because the marriage itself was voided as if it had never legally existed. There was also the matter of the wedding costs, most of which Ethan's family had paid for as a gesture of generosity toward two families they'd assumed were becoming one. I heard secondhand that his mother Eleanor pursued reimbursement from my parents for a portion of the costs my parents had agreed to cover and hadn't yet paid. The open bar overage, mostly around $11,000, and that my parents settled that debt within 2 months rather than fight it, partly out of guilt, partly because Eleanor made clear she had no interest in dragging the matter through court and airing an already humiliating situation any further than it had already been aired. Vanessa lost her job at the event planning firm in Boston about 6 weeks later, though the firm never officially connected it to the wedding. Officially, it was a restructuring. Unofficially, 3 separate people who still worked there told mutual acquaintances that the story of the collapsed wedding had spread through Boston's fairly small event planning and hospitality circles within days, given how many vendors and industry contacts had been present or heard about it immediately after, and that Prestige Event Collective had quietly decided a planner whose own wedding had become the subject of gossip across every venue in the city was no longer an asset to the brand they wanted to project to high-end clients. Vanessa herself apparently told friends she'd been let go over unrelated performance issues, but the timing spoke for itself. She moved back in with our parents in November into her childhood bedroom, which I understand from my mother remains largely untouched from when she left it at 18. I haven't been to that house since the wedding. I don't know if I will be again anytime soon, though my father has started driving down to Philadelphia every few weeks instead, meeting me for coffee near my office, slowly, carefully, rebuilding something between us in small increments rather than one dramatic reconciliation. I do want to pause here and say something, because I think it matters, and because I've thought about it a lot in the month since. This isn't a story I'm telling you because I feel triumphant about my sister's life falling apart. There's a version of this story that could be told with a kind of gleeful cruelty, and I don't want to tell it that way, because that's not actually what I felt, sitting in my apartment that first night, or in the weeks after. What I felt mostly was relief. Relief that I hadn't spent one more day carrying a secret that wasn't mine to protect. Relief that I hadn't sat quietly through one more humiliation and called it keeping the peace. And underneath all of it, something sadder. Grief, I think, for the sister I might have had. If things in our family had gone differently, if somebody, anybody, had said to both of us, at some point in the last 3 decades, that there was room enough for 2 daughters to be loved without one of us disappearing to make space for the other. By December, 3 months after the wedding, I finally agreed to see Vanessa in person. My mother had been asking gently for weeks, not pushing, just mentioning it each time we talked, and I think what finally moved me wasn't forgiveness exactly, but curiosity. I wanted to look at my sister once, face to face, without a hallway or a wedding or an audience between us, and see who was actually there. We met at a diner in Wayne, near our parents' house, on a gray Tuesday afternoon in the slow hour between lunch and dinner, when the place was mostly empty. Vanessa was already in a booth when I arrived, and I almost didn't recognize her for a second. Not because she looked different physically, though she'd lost weight in a way that read more like stress than intention, but because of how small she seemed. The version of my sister I'd carried in my head for 29 years was larger than life, always the center of whatever room she was in. The woman sitting in that booth, stirring coffee she wasn't drinking, looked like someone who'd been quietly deflating for months. "I didn't think you'd come," she said when I sat down across from her. "I almost didn't." We sat with that for a while, the waitress refilling my coffee, neither of us quite finding the door into the conversation we both knew we needed to have. Vanessa finally broke it. "I've replayed that day about 4,000 times," she said, staring at her cup. "The hallway thing wasn't even my idea originally, if that matters at all. Mom mentioned putting you somewhere out of the way because she was worried you'd, and I'm quoting her, bring energy that doesn't match the day. I just didn't stop it. And then I made it worse, because I wanted to see if I could." She looked up at me. "I don't know why I wanted that. I've thought about it constantly, and I still don't have a real answer." "What did you want to see?" I asked. "If you'd finally push back, or if you'd just take it, the way you always do." Her voice cracked slightly on the last few words. "And when you didn't fight me in that hallway, when you just said that thing about how I was the one pushing you out, I panicked. A little. Because it was true. And I think some part of me had spent years needing you to be the villain in this so I didn't have to look at what I actually was." I didn't say anything right away. I let her sit in it. "I'm not going to tell you I forgive everything," she continued. "I don't think I've earned the right to ask for that yet. But I am sorry, Claire. Genuinely. Not because it blew up publicly and I lost my job and my marriage and basically my whole life as I knew it. I was already sorry, sitting alone in my old bedroom at 29, before any of that fully hit me. I was sorry the moment I said it. I just didn't know how to take it back in front of 200 people. I believed her, or at least I believed that the version of sorry she was capable of in that moment was real. I didn't tell her everything was fine. It wasn't. And I've learned enough by 34 to know that saying it's fine before it actually is just delays the real reckoning further down the road, usually for both people. "I need you to actually see me, Vanessa," I told her. "Not compare me. Not use me as the measuring stick for how well you're doing. Just see me, as a person, separate from you. I don't think you ever have." She nodded and started crying quietly, not the performative crying I'd half expected given everything Olivia's screenshots had revealed about her capacity for exactly that kind of manufactured emotion, but something that looked, to me, genuinely unrehearsed. "I don't know if I know how," she admitted. "But I'd like to learn, if you'll let me try." I told her I would think about it. I meant it. I'm still thinking about it, honestly, months later. Some wounds don't close on a single diner conversation, no matter how honest it is, and I've decided I'm allowed to take my time deciding how much room I make for my sister going forward, rather than rushing back into old patterns just because she finally said some true things out loud. What did change almost immediately was my relationship with my parents. Not perfectly, not completely, but noticeably. My father started calling every Sunday, just to talk, not to relay information about Vanessa or manage some family logistics, but actually to ask about my life, my job, a triathlon I'd started training for, a guy I'd gone on 2 dates with in October that hadn't gone anywhere, but that my father, for the first time in my adult life, asked follow-up questions about instead of changing the subject back to my sister within 30 seconds. My mother, for her part, sent me a card in early December, handwritten, 4 pages long, that I still have in the drawer of my nightstand. I won't share all of it, because some of it is just for me, but the line that mattered most said, I spent so long thinking my job was to protect Vanessa that I forgot I had two daughters who both needed protecting, including from each other. I'm sorry it took losing so much to see that clearly. I don't know if my family will ever look the way I once imagined a family was supposed to look, back when I was young enough to still believe that imagined version was achievable. But I think, for the first time, we're building something more honest than what we had before, even if it's smaller and slower and comes without any guarantee of how it turns out. As for me, in October, about a month after the wedding, I took that vacation I'd promised myself the night I drove home from Cedar Hollow Lodge. 5 days alone on the Outer Banks, a rented cottage 2 blocks from the water, no family calls, no work email except a single check-in each morning. I walked the beach every day, sometimes for hours, and somewhere around the third day, I stopped thinking about the wedding entirely. Stopped replaying the hallway and the trash bins and my sister's voice telling me I was never meant to matter, and started thinking instead about what I actually wanted the next chapter of my life to look like, now that I wasn't spending so much energy trying to earn a place in someone else's. I think about that hallway sometimes, still, not with the sting it used to carry, more like a marker, a place on the map of my life where something ended and something else, quieter and steadier, began. My sister thought putting me there would make her shine brighter by comparison. She forgot something my grandmother tried to teach me a long time ago, back when I was young enough to still need reminding. The truth doesn't need anyone's permission to find the spotlight. It just needs someone brave enough, eventually, to stop protecting the people who don't deserve protecting anymore. I arrived at that wedding hoping, in some small, stubborn corner of myself, to finally feel like I belonged to my family the way I always wanted to. I left with something I hadn't expected to find instead, something worth infinitely more than a seat at any table. I left having finally found myself. If this story kept you hooked, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below. Thanks for watching.